Hello and welcome to Dialogue. As the Russia-Ukraine conflict nears 2 years anniversary, there's more and more talk of a possible peace deal following the failure of a counter-offensive operation by the Ukraine in summer. Meanwhile, Western support for Kyiv seems less solid than before, and the war fatigue becomes more visible. So what is the latest situation on the ground? Could a peace deal be close at hand? And after 21 months of fighting, what is the most likely outcome of the conflict? To take a closer look, I'm joined by Anton Fedyashin, Associate Professor in the History Department of American University, Mark Sloboda, Moscow-based International Affairs and Security Analyst, and Peter Zamayev, Director of the Eurasia Democracy Initiative. That's our topic. I'm Xu Qinduo. Welcome to Dialogue. Anton, I will start with you. So as we said, we are not seeing really big changes on the battlefield, but we do see changes or murmuring of the emergence of the calls for a peace deal or for negotiation between the two sides. How do you characterize the current situation in terms of the Ukraine war?
The Ukrainian counteroffensive has, unfortunately for Kyiv, failed. Not only has it failed, but the Ukrainians have lost territory along the northern part of the front lines, and plus they've lost an enormous amount of men and material. We know that not from figures, but from the fact that there's serious talk in Kyiv about launching massive total mobilization this week, and we'll see if this actually happens. Territorially, not much has changed, but this continues to be a war of attrition, and Russia, with its strategic depth and its much bigger army and its much bigger economy, is poised to come out of this war of attrition the victor. Now, how that is going to happen is unclear. And now that we see that the West is beginning to put pressure on the Ukrainian side to come to some kind of agreement, I think that the biggest news in this war will now start shifting towards the geopolitical aspect, the diplomatic aspect of this, and what form the negotiations will take once they start.
So Peter, I wonder if you agree with Anton. So we are seeing a shift, like a mostly political shift, a diplomatic shift, rather than the change on the battlefield. That is probably there is an emergence of calls for peaceful negotiation since there's a stalemate. Is that what you sensed or what you get in Kyiv?
Well, obviously, it's been now acknowledged by both the political and not so much even political, but the military leadership of Ukraine that the war has sort of reached a stalemate, and in the absence of a breakthrough in weaponry and the kinds of weapons that Ukraine is getting from its Western allies, it will be very naive to expect a significant breakthrough on the part of Ukrainians, sort of what we saw in Kherson and Kharkiv almost exactly a year ago. Having said that, what the previous speaker said about Ukraine being, encouraged, if not forced, to think about sitting down at the negotiating table with the Russians, so far it's been from hearsay. And yes, if we're talking about that article in Bild, the German newspaper, once again, all the sources we have for that sort of idea are anonymous. They're anonymous sources. So far, officially, we have not heard from any Western leader that, the two sides need to start negotiating as soon as possible. Once again, having said that, there is fatigue. Yes, there's fatigue with the war on both sides, on the Russian side, on the Ukrainian side, and on the side of Ukrainian Western allies. We are not there yet because I think there's a lot of suspicion, both on the part of Ukrainians and Western countries, that Vladimir Putin wants to negotiate an end to this war. It seems that Vladimir Putin is ratcheting up the military effort, and maybe, come March and his, election, where he's obviously a shoo-in, and we can expect him to be reelected with at least 80% of support, he may call another huge wave of mobilization. So we're just simply not there yet, no matter what Ukrainians are wishing for or the Western countries are wishing for. Vladimir Putin is showing no genuine signs that he's willing to sit down and negotiate with the Ukrainian government, which he doesn't even recognize as legitimate, and neither does he recognize Ukraine's right to exist as a sovereign state as a legitimate right.
But let me first have Mark. Mark, in terms of this, development, or where we are going here on the Ukraine crisis, President Putin said recently, it is necessary to think about how to stop the tragedy of the conflict in Ukraine, and Russia has never refused to participate in peace talks with Ukraine. He used the word never. So it sounds like this is the consistent policy of Russia to solve this problem through negotiation, through peaceful manner. Is that the case?
Well, I mean, it is true that Russia has always maintained the possibility of negotiations to settle this conflict. But it must be said that that is on Russia's terms, right? Russia is not interested in any terms but its own, which were those it clearly set out at the beginning of the intervention in the Ukrainian civil conflict in 2022. And since then, because of the escalation by NATO through their proxy putsch regime in Kiev, that has only strengthened to include the oblasts of Kherson and Zaporozhye as well, now that they have also conducted referendums and chosen to get out of dodge of the mad regime in Kiev and join the Russian Federation. However, it is the Kiev regime that has passed diktats that forbid its own officials from even negotiating with the Russian government. So I have to agree with Peter. I don't believe that there is any serious push by Western governments to force their proxy regime in Kiev to the negotiating table, and certainly not on any terms that Russia would accept. I expect this conflict will continue for years in the future into its inevitable, if costly, conclusion.
Mm-hmm. Well, Anton, back to this, let's say, the negotiation as a solution to solve the problem. There's a confirmation from a heavyweight, let's say, the Ukraine official who is close to President Zelensky. In the interview, he admitted, there's a point very close to a deal between Moscow and Kyiv at the early stage of the conflict, but finally they didn't do that. So that is, what do you make of that confirmation? Why he was talking about that now?
Well, because that was this was David Rahami you're talking about. He gave an interview, a TV interview, to the 1+1 channel in Ukraine. And yes, he admitted what those of us who have been following this conflict knew for a while now, because it was admitted by Turkish officials. Naftali Bennett, who was the Prime Minister of Israel, who was involved in mediating the March 2022 talks, which is that there was a peace deal that had been drafted, initialed by both sides, and the Ukrainians walked away from it under pressure from the United States and from Great Britain. Boris Johnson flew into Kiev and essentially told the Ukrainians, and again, this is what Arahamiya confirmed in his interview, that the West will not provide Ukraine with any security guarantees if Ukraine follows the diplomatic path out of the conflict that the West expects it to fight, and that it will provide it with everything that it needs. So that's a story that everyone sort of knows already, who's been following the comments of Western politicians around what was going on in Belarus and in the negotiations in Minsk less than a year ago. The question is, why is all of this coming out now? And I think that this is one of those puzzle pieces that come together to form a picture where Ukrainian politicians are encouraged to make statements that put pressure on Zelensky's government and on President Zelensky himself to start coming to the negotiating table. Whether the Ukrainians trust the Russians or not, I think is moot, because the Russians don't trust the Ukrainians or their Western backers for that matter. And they point to the Minsk agreement, which was actually international law because it was unanimously voted on by the UN Security Council, and that Ukraine failed to implement, and it could have avoided this catastrophe that's been unfolding over the past several months. So neither side trusts each other, and that's exactly why diplomacy needs to start happening, because the alternative to any form of talks, no matter how unpleasant they will be for both sides, especially for the Ukrainian side, and I understand the difficulty in which President Zelensky finds himself, the alternative to this is the continuation of this war. And if Mark is right that this will continue for many months, then Ukraine is going to be on the losing side for several reasons. First of all, it doesn't have the strategic depth. Second of all, I think your viewers absolutely need to understand that what Ukraine receives from the West is not just military support. The entire Ukrainian budget from month to month is paid for by Western taxpayers. And this is not going to last for months and months and years. And we're already seeing how things are changing in Washington, D.C. Here, where I am, the U.S. Congress has decided to take a month off before even beginning to decide on future support for Ukraine. And this cannot be good news for Kiev. And I doubt that it will be better. I think the Congress will approve funds for Ukraine, although they will be much smaller than they were before. And the trajectory so far is for shrinking support, not increasing support.
Mm-hmm. Well, Peter, I think Anton has pointed out a fact that is, of course, you talked about the, fatigue and, the gloomy mood. That's understandable. After all, it's almost 2 years, as we said. But then, the key player is the Western, key factor is the support from the Western world, both financially and militarily. Militarily, I think the Ukrainian side is demanding more advanced weapons, but it's not there yet. And then, financially, even we are seeing uncertainty, let's say, from U.S. side and also from European Union. People are not sure whether they are going to have this 50 billion euro on the next summit in next month. So do you think that's also something in the mind of the Ukrainian leadership in terms of how to solve this conflict?
Well, of course, it is in the mind of the Ukrainian leadership. Let me just very quick 2 points by way of correction of what the characterization of the previous two speakers. Very quickly, Anton, the professor, said that the Minsk agreement was not implemented by Ukraine. That's a perversion of history. I think the main point there was for the Russians to withdraw to the constitutional borders, the sovereign borders of Ukraine. They never did that. So it's an open question who really violated the Minsk agreement. And Mark Sleboda said that, mentioned the invasion of Kherson and Zaporizhia as if that's part of Putin's original plan. Don't forget that Putin claimed that his goal was to liberate the Russian speakers of the Donbass, of the eastern part of Ukraine. So what in the world are the Russians doing in Kherson and Zaporizhia in the south of Ukraine? And they've already annexed those parts and changed the constitution to reflect their sovereignty over these territories. This just shows you that this is an imperial, a war of grabbing another country's territory, style on the 17th century conquests in Europe. As to your question regarding the Western support, and we mentioned Congress, this is where obviously the part and parcel of the support resides. The military assistance, the bulk of it comes from the U.S. And what I've heard from Mike Johnson, the new Speaker of Congress, is actually very encouraging. He himself has said, I'm quoting, he's confident and optimistic that Congress will be able to pass additional funds because they're tied as part of a package, including Israel and Ukraine and the border with Mexico and even in other areas. He says there's a sense of urgency in getting aid to both Israel and Ukraine. And finally, and very crucial, we can't allow Russian President Vladimir Putin to march through Europe, and we understand the necessity of helping Ukraine. Yes, there is, I don't see that support will increase necessarily, but I don't see that in the near future, at least, the drop-off will be drastic. Western countries understand that they will be shooting themselves in the foot by allowing Putin to walk over Ukraine. This will create a dangerous precedent for the security of the rest of Europe. And I'm talking about the Baltic states. I'm talking about Moldova. It's a whole domino effect. Do European leaders, do Western leaders have an answer to this war? They don't. But at the same time, I do not see a resolve on their part to just drop Ukraine, to force it to come to the negotiating table before it is time to do so. It's a very complicated question. There's no black or white scenarios here, but also to say that they will just let and leave Ukraine hanging in the wind, I think that's also very premature.
Very premature, I mean, to leave Ukraine alone. So, Mark, of course, just like the U.S., I think the Defense Secretary said that, we have to, basically support Ukraine. I mean, if Putin wins this war and that somehow Russia will move beyond Ukraine to European territory. Okay, you earlier mentioned about if there's a peace deal, it must be on conditions of Moscow. So what are the conditions? What is the exactly goal of Moscow?
Yeah, despite the narrative spun by Peter Zalmayev echoing the Westback Kiev Putsch regime, Russia has been quite clear from the beginning about their goals. Yes, it was to fully liberate the people of Donbass, to stop the Kiev regime's 10-year bloody war on that part of the country for refusing to accept the overthrow of the government, the last legitimate democratically elected government that they had elected in Kiev. As well as that, the Ukrainian constitution should be returned to what it was before the overthrow in the government in 2014, which was a guarantee of Ukraine's neutrality, that it should not join NATO or the Russian-backed Collective Security Treaty Organization or any other military alliance, but also the demilitarization of Ukraine, the denazification, perhaps much better termed as the debanderization of Ukraine. And since the conflict has commenced, the Kherson and Zaporozhye, which fell into Russia's hands very early into the conflict with almost no fighting, because the people there largely didn't want to fight for the regime in Kiev. And in fact, the Kiev regime has launched an investigation conducted by the Ukrainian intelligence agency as to exactly what happened there, with the ultimate political goal probably of pointing the finger at Zaluzhny for either treason or incompetence. Those are the specific goals. But it must be said, as NATO has escalated further in this conflict, I think that the minds in the Kremlin have hardened. I think that they see that there is no possibility of a diplomatic negotiated solution, either with the proxy regime in Kiev or, more importantly, with the United States, that can be trusted. Because of the failures of, the February 21st agreement, the Minsk Accords, and every other agreement that, that the U.S. has pulled out of in the last couple of decades. Therefore, we have heard repeatedly from Dmitry Medvedev, the former president and prime minister, and still deputy chair of the Security Council. We have heard from Lavrov. We have heard from numerous Russian officials that this ends in regime change. And that is a long, bloody, costly war of attrition road. But I do not see any other way that Russia's goals for this intervention in the Ukrainian civil conflict can succeed.
Oh, well, I mean, if that's the goal, Anton, if that is the goal, I mean, that's a still long way off. But the foreign minister of Russia, Mr. Lavrov, in response to the U.S. Defense Secretary, what they said, he pointed out Moscow does not have plans to expand its territory any further in Europe. Do you believe that's the case? Because there's a talk of like, oh, Russia will go beyond Ukraine.
Right. So, no, I see no signs of the Russians trying to expand their influence or their territory into the rest of Europe. First of all, they'll face NATO. Second of all, they've got enough problems in Ukraine. I think what they're doing is what the Russian state in all of its iterations, be it Soviet or imperial or even Muscovite, has done over centuries, which is create buffer zones. And the Russians tried to do that with an agreement with NATO about a buffer zone of non-NATO and non-Russian dominated area to the west of Russia, including Belarus and Ukraine and Moldova. And that, of course, did not work out. That was the essence of the Russian proposal from December and January of 21 going into 22. I think the Russians are also looking for a way out of this, but they are not going to sit down at the negotiating table sort of in ignorance of the realities on the ground. And the realities on the ground right now is that they, as Peter correctly mentioned, they have annexed territories beyond the Donbass. They did so in September. In other words, last year, in other words, they did it months after the beginning of the war because they didn't plan to fight such a long-term conflict. And I think they are going to now negotiate the total annexation of the Donetsk and Luhansk provinces. They're going to probably push for more territory of the Kherson and Zaporizhia territory. And there's a lot of talk about their going towards Odessa. All of this is very early to really seriously discuss because things are going so slowly. But if this is going to be solved on the battlefields, again, so far, the pendulum has swung in Russia's favor simply because it has enormous resources that neither Ukraine by itself nor the Western economies, as we are now figuring out, possess, because the Russians are outproducing all of NATO plus its allies and partners in Asia in terms of artillery shells. And I don't see how a military solution to this conflict is going to turn out in Ukraine's favor, unfortunately, which again points us all, or rather the warring sides, towards a diplomatic settlement. But that is going to be a very long-term and very difficult affair, but there's simply no alternative to it.
Mm-hmm. So, Pedro, what's the response? What do people think about this? For example, Western countries are running out of the ammo in terms of military support, and financially they are also meeting, experiencing this is political difficult. At least it's not as solid as in the past. Is there a concern? Is there a worry that somehow this conflict has to be resolved through negotiation, and that will be probably not on terms of Ukraine?
Well, contrary to what either side was saying, that, the other side only understands force. Both the Ukrainians were saying that about the Russians, and the Russians are saying that about Ukrainians, and then the only solution is a military one. Pretty much every solution to every military conflict in history has been through negotiations, one way or another. Let's be realistic about this. Once again, both speakers, all of us, the entire panel, has acknowledged coming from different sides and different sympathies on this issue, that we're not there yet, And yes, there are problems. There's a huge disparity in what even a country such as North Korea, the size of North Korea, has provided Russia with more shells, artillery shells of 155 millimeter caliber than Europe combined is able to provide Ukraine in a year. This speaks to the need for Western societies, Western countries, to think long and hard about their own defense capabilities and about what they have said and promised to Ukraine. They have to match their rhetoric with deeds, or if they can't, then they have to start talking about negotiations and come up with a plan, what they are suggesting, what they're proposing. Having said that, obviously the United States, no matter what we think about their capabilities of helping Ukraine, they have a lot of weaponry. They have a lot of weaponry in the storage that they just haven't had the political will to have a decisive victory by Ukraine on the battlefield. Whether it would have been possible then, if it's not possible now anymore, that's part of history. The history will decide. But there's much more weapons in America's storages that we can even suppose. Obviously, America is now stretched with the need to also support its ally in the Middle East, Israel. But even having said that, most military experts will tell you that there's still enough that America can do to help Ukraine. But in all Western countries, there needs to be a rethinking of their military strategies. There needs to be political will shown to significantly boost their military budgets and military production.
Mm-hmm. And Tom, do you think there is a political will or lack of that, rather, in Washington or in Brussels? I mean, especially when there's a presidential election upcoming in the United States. There's, for example, the Republican, Mr. Johnson, the new speaker in the House. He separated basically the bill for providing support to both Ukraine and Israel. Basically, he said, he has the Congress approved this bill to support Israel. But Ukraine support is left alone right now, at least for now. And obviously, there's both are priorities, but seems Israel is the priority before Ukraine.
Yes, it clearly is, and most people, without stating so openly, have communicated it. Political figures here in Washington in multiple ways. Again, I believe that Congress will pass a budget that will contain support for Ukraine. But look, the trend in Washington is towards a decrease in this support. The political will to throw everything at Ukraine the way it was done last spring and summer is simply not there any longer in the United States. And the direct and factual proof of that is that Congress is in no hurry to approve this aid right now. They have already sort of decided to put this off until January, and then they will continue to discuss this. In other words, they're taking a holiday while Ukraine is hanging on by the skin of its teeth. So no one in their right mind can argue that Washington is as committed to the support of Ukraine now as it was several months ago. This is very bad news for the Ukrainians, because this means that this war is going to be moved off the front pages, and the nightly news casts, which I watch and read on a regular basis, Ukraine is simply not the top story anymore. And as the election approaches, I think it will be in the Biden administration's interest to sort of marginalize this issue, because it is not a victory for Washington or NATO or the West, let alone Ukraine. And bringing this up will only make matters worse for the Biden administration, which is going to be on the defensive against whatever Republican candidate comes out on the top. That's the fate of incumbents in American elections in general, and the Biden administration, with age, of course, guaranteed to be used by the Republicans against Joe Biden personally. All of this is going to come together to create a very difficult election season for the Democrats.
Yeah, very difficult time ahead. With that, we come to the end of today's show. Many thanks to our guests. You can also find us on the CGTN app on YouTube. Thank you for being with us. I'm Xu Qinduo. See you next time.